I'm your host, Eric Eisenberg. Welcome to Hero Blend number 30. The DC Cinematic Universe is constantly growing, and this week we got huge news about an Aquaman solo movie in development at Warner Brothers. Are audiences ready for this project, and when should it fit in? There's a lot to talk about, so check it out. Welcome back, everyone. This week, I am once again glad to have as my co-host, Mr. Sean O'Connell from Cinema Blend. How's it going, man?
It's wonderful. Always a pleasure.
Well, we have a lot to talk about this week because for the past couple, ever since Comic-Con, really, we've been hearing a lot about the DC Cinematic Universe growing. We've heard about untitled projects being announced between now and 2020. But the project kind of this week to talk about is Aquaman, because we've heard this week that two writers were brought on to work on a potential script. Will Beal, Kurt Johnstad, both working on separate scripts that Warner Brothers will eventually decide which one's better and move forward with. But Aquaman, I think, is a bit of a controversial character because he has had a couple years of kind of punchline status where he hasn't necessarily been taken seriously as a superhero. So I'm curious, Sean, what is your opinion about the idea of a developing Aquaman movie?
I think it's essential. He's a important factor to the Justice League, and if they want to build to that point, he's one of the characters we obviously have to see. I'm definitely concerned by the idea of they don't have a filmmaker who had a strong enough idea, or a screenwriter who had a strong enough idea that brought it to the studio that convinced them that way. Like, it almost feels like they're working a little bit backwards of, we need an Aquaman movie, who's going to get us there, versus, you know, someone has a great idea for an Aquaman movie, and they're going to go with that one. The idea of the two scripts competing with each other gives me a lot of pause, because to me, he's an unusual hero, and there are so many other factors that play into bringing him to life, and the fact that a lot of it's underwater, and it's a complicated environment to bring to life. And, you know, even with Superman, we're dealing with extraterrestrials and aliens on our planet, so it's possible to go that way. But I just think I'd feel better about it if someone had a really strong opinion and voice in terms of the character and the story, and Warner Brothers was greenlighting it because they were pitched that strong pitch, and not just because they feel like they need the hero.
Well, I definitely understand where you're coming from, but as you mentioned, and I think what it really comes from, the reason for this development is because, as you mentioned, Aquaman is a very important Justice League character. He's a core member of that team. He's been there from the very beginning. But to kind of get to your point about not having a filmmaker already attached, I think what this basically is Warner Brothers and DC kind of setting the base for what they have an idea of what they could do with an Aquaman, figuring out kind of that baseline level, and then finding a filmmaker to kind of take it make it into a feature film. Marvel actually does this a lot. I mean, we actually heard a lot about with Guardians of the Galaxy. Nicole Perlman was the first person to start working on this script before James Gunn was brought in, and then he kind of was the one that brought his vision to it and kind of made it live. So I kind of get that development strategy. That being said, I also don't think it's necessarily unfair. I think it is unfair, the bad rap that Aquaman has gotten over the years. Zack Snyder has actually addressed this very recently. He called in to a talk radio show to explain why Aquaman isn't the joke that we think he is. He's not just the stupid superhero who can only do things underwater, can only talk to fish, while Batman and Superman are off taking care of like the real threats.
Right.
But there is an interesting story to Aquaman. I mean, this is also a superhero who lost his arm and had to replace it with a hook. There is a badass element to Arthur Curry, and there's a lot of drama that can be taken out of kind of protecting the underwater world versus the world on top of the surface. I think that's a lot of potential there. Do you think that Warner Brothers and DC have a reason to be worried about audiences' perception of this character?
Yeah, I think that they do. In terms of any of these, like, I think Marvel has the same problem with Ant-Man. And I even saw Peyton Reed addressing this. Like, if you know that his power is to talk to ants, how intimidating can that be? But Peyton Reed was saying we have ways of exploring his powers that we think are going to be really exciting for audiences. And so I trust that Warner Brothers is going to find new and exciting ways to explore the admittedly cool powers of Aquaman. I think it's just costly. But I mean, if James Cameron can produce Pandora, Pandora, was that the name of that place? Using CGI, you can do almost anything nowadays, and you don't have to. It's not like we're going to have Steven Spielberg on a boat trying to shoot Jaws. There are ways to replicate that now. So And I think the comic book audience is willing to go the extra mile with these new characters. You know, I grew up with the Aquaman of the animated Justice League series where, you know, he touched his head and it was like those sonar things shooting out.
Okay.
That's cheesy, and if that's your only knowledge of Aquaman, I can understand why you might have a little bit of concern about what he's going to look like on the big screen. But if you cast someone like Jason Momoa and you tell me, like, eventually he's going to be fighting alongside, you know, Batman and Superman in a movie, then I'm pretty much on board. I just don't want... I know the big concern is origin stories, and I don't know if I want to hear too much about his origin story. I'd almost like to rather hit the ground running with him.
That was actually going to be my next question, which is, and I actually completely agree with you. I don't think that we need an Aquaman origin story. I think Aquaman can just be Aquaman. He's been living under the ocean. And I think it's the same way that sounds like what they're doing with Batman v Superman, where Batman is a character who's just been around for a really long time. Same with Wonder Woman. These are established characters. They're not going to just... we're not going to have to go through that whole rigmarole again of having to explain. I mean, these are new characters that we have never seen in a live-action feature before. But at the same time, we don't need the explanation. And honestly, I think we are at a point where we're beyond the origin story. We can accept that characters are... that superheroes exist within a larger universe. And at this point, what we want is to put them together. We don't necessarily just want them to kind of go on their own adventure and then eventually set up. If anything, what Marvel has taught us, it's that we want these heroes to kind of become just fully functioning solo characters that can eventually kind of hook up with other heroes. And they don't need an origin story to do that. Like, I think they can immediately jump into a story where Aquaman is having problems with the either having surface problems with the humans on Earth, or he's having a problem with the royal family. I mean, there are a lot of options for an Aquaman story to take, and I think an origin story would just be unnecessary.
I don't know anything about his villains, though. He doesn't strike me as someone from the DC comic universe that has a memorable nemesis that we would look forward to, the way we would like a Joker or a Lex Luthor. Does he have one that I don't know about?
Honestly, to be perfectly honest, Aquaman isn't my strongest character, but I think, but there are characters, every character has their own super specific supervillain that they can go, there is a go-to hero, or a go-to villain, that's not something that necessarily work about. If you really think about it, did many people know about Loki before Thor really hit? So, I'm not necessarily sure that you necessarily need a big-name villain. Do you think that's what would drive the story?
No, not at all. That's a great comparison, is, Asgard as a realm, and people having to get to know that, and then casting somebody like they did with Hiddleston to just... like, he is Loki now. Even though Loki's had a rich history in the comic books, if they cast somebody who's a great foil to whoever they get as Aquaman, you almost don't have to worry too much about setting up that world, because I think everyone's very familiar with Asgard now, and they can keep introducing new characters in that realm. But they hit the ground with the first Thor, with all of these really interesting Asgardian characters, and easily converted that over into, now there's a new world for filmmakers to play in, and we can keep going back to Thor. So that's a really good template to follow.
Totally. And, while we're on the subject of casting, it's not officially confirmed. Nobody will actually say it's a thing, but it sounds like that Jason Momoa is Aquaman. It's an interesting choice, because the guy does have a fan following thanks to his years on Stargate and Game of Thrones. But the one solo movie that he was given the chance to kind of show himself as a star was Conan the Barbarian, which was a terrible film. And I wouldn't necessarily blame that on him, of course, because it's just... in fact, I'd almost say he's fine. It's just the material for that film is completely awful. But what is your opinion of Jason Momoa? Do you think that he's a proper fit for this character?
I think he'd be fine for it. He seems bulky. He looks like a superhero, but he seems bulkier than what I would think Aquaman to be, but it's just my perception, and it could be completely wrong. If I were casting a superhero movie, obviously The Rock would be one of the first people I'd go to, but Momoa would definitely be up there also. And maybe his background in Game of Thrones is really setting up, like, if they establish a universe the way that Game of Thrones has so successfully established one, that's another way that they can really drop audiences into this pre-existing...
Yeah, it's a great one.
Yeah, it'd be fantastic. And so maybe his experience in that is really what is winning Warner Brothers over. And maybe the two screenwriters have been given the directive of approach it as close to something like Game of Thrones as you can, where there's already this rich, lineage of this family line, and there's royalty, and there's all these really exciting places that you can go, because then you can introduce people like Batman and Superman and the other Justice League members, even Wonder Woman, and they could really mess with what already exists for this character. All of a sudden, yeah, there seems like a lot of exciting places that it can go. I'm not willing to shoot him down in terms of casting. I don't know enough about him just yet, but we've shown, as you mentioned with Schwarzenegger, the right role just automatically makes somebody a star.
Exactly, and I mean, I think the thing that interests me about Momoa the most is, I mean, obviously DC, one of the things that they're doing to kind of differentiate themselves from Marvel is that they are kind of going with a darker, grittier tone. I mean, I hate using that phrase, but it's appropriate. And what they kind of get with Jason Momoa and Aquaman is that you do kind of go the opposite direction of that Aquaman as a punchline thing, because you're not going to laugh in Jason Momoa's face and say, hey, you're Aquaman. I mean, the guy looks too intimidating and scary to do that. And as mentioned, this is a character who has kind of a cool history, has a badass backstory, and again, at one point gets his arm hacked, like he has to cut his hand off and replaces it with a hook. Like, I think that Jason Momoa is good casting in just the sense that you have to make Aquaman a badass, essentially, in order to make that film work. And I think Momoa can probably fill that. I think he can do that really well.
But most people aren't going to go see it because he's in it. They'll see it because it's an Aquaman movie. Like,
I think that's an excellent point. And I think, honestly, Guardians may be a good litmus test for that kind of thing, because Guardians, a lot of people attribute the success of Guardians being as just coming from the success of the Marvel brand. It kind of pushed that. If DC can do that exact same kind of thing, they could use that to easily get Aquaman in, or get audiences into the theater for Aquaman.
Well, you get to the point, too, where these comic book companies have to go further down their bench. Like for DC, it's Batman and Superman. They're the heavy hitters. For Marvel, I mean, it's Spider-Man and Captain America probably, although Spider-Man's not theirs. But eventually, Marvel's going down the bench. Doctor Strange and Ant-Man are down the bench characters. Yep. And for DC, you know, if they get to Green Arrow or Green Lantern or Aquaman's kind of like the middle of the bench, close to the front, I think. It seems like the four to me were Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and I put Aquaman with them, but maybe he's not with them. I don't know.
Well, I think you kind of maybe put him towards the end of the Justice League simply because, as mentioned, the whole kind of bad PR, I guess, would be the best way. But we're running out of time, so here's the question that I'll pose. When do you want to see an Aquaman movie? Do you see it coming out before Justice League? Do you see it coming out after? Where do you think is the best place to put this film?
I think I'd want to see it between... It's just so funny because it's so far out. Like, if Batman v Superman introduces Wonder Woman as a substantial character, she has a part in it, and not just a cameo reference. I'd almost want to see it right after Batman v Superman to establish him more as a character, and then you get to Justice League, and then beyond, you know, after whatever events are laid out in Justice League, then you can sort of take those characters into their own standalones, and then Wonder Woman can get her own movie, then Aquaman can get his own movie, then maybe we can have that Flash and Green Lantern, or Flash and Arrow. How is it going to be?
Yeah, that was it.
Then maybe you can have those afterwards. So I'd probably want to put it right after Snyder's Batman Superman, maybe have another director do the Aquaman movie, and then have the events of that maybe funnel into Justice League. But this is like fantasy football. I mean, we're really going way far out.
No, and honestly, I think that you make a very excellent point with the Wonder Woman statement, in that a lot of it depends on how much we're going to be seeing from Wonder Woman, because that is a very, very important character in the DC universe, and you don't want to see her kind of get kind of underdone while Aquaman all of a sudden gets his own movie. But at the same time, it does seem like Wonder Woman's going to be a significant part of Batman v Superman, even if she's not in the title. But I do agree he is a key Justice League character. I think I agree that I would like to see him come before Justice League, as opposed to being just introduced. We may actually get an Aquaman cameo in Batman v Superman, which would be cool. Depending on how that works out, who knows how that could affect a solo film. There are definitely a lot of options, a ton of questions, not a ton of answers right now. But I think there's going to be a ton to speculate about in the future, and it's going to be a fun ride.
A lot of it fueled by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's Twitter feed.
Yeah, exactly, of course. Well, Sean, thank you so much for being on the show again with me this week, man.
No problem. I'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Have a great week, everyone.